I'm sharing with you a series of lessons on world evangelization. In this particular lesson, I'm going to call it Arabian Light. Arabian Light. And what I'm going to try to do in this lesson is show the contrast between Islam and Christianity. The contrast. Now, let me begin by making a general statement. Islam is a religion. It is more than just a religion. It is also a culture, and more than that, it is a spirit. A spirit. So you have to understand, when we speak about Islam, we're speaking about more than just somebody that goes to a mosque. It's a religion, a culture, and a spirit. Now, what I want to do, I want to show the differences between Christianity and Islam. And there are so many of them. And of course, I will not be able to enumerate all of them, but let me give you some of them. Number one, it is a religion of good works. Good works. Everything about Islam is built around works. Now, please don't be offended, but listen to me very carefully. I've discovered that other than Christianity, every religion in the world is based on good works. Good works. And that is a mistake. In Christianity, it's based on what Jesus has already done. Jesus did the work. He finished the work. We believe in what he has accomplished. But Islam is a religion of good works. And there is no assurance of salvation unless you die fighting what they call holy war. Of course, I think that is a misnomer, but that's what they believe. They call it holy war. And so it's their religion of good works. Now, let me give you some principles to help you understand. The very name Islam means to submit. Submit. That's what it means. And that's the reason that they can use the sword to try to force people into submission. Islam is a system of religious rules. Religious rules. They have all kinds of religious rules. In fact, if you listen to their teachers have created rules for every aspect of life. They've got a rule for everything. It's a system of rules. But here's the problem. Rules cannot change human nature. It can't change who we really are. And so these are simply statistics that I have discovered in my studies. Do you realize the top 5 nations in the world for pornography are all Islamic countries? Now, I'm just simply quoting the statistics. The top 5 nations. Why? Because they've got all kinds of rules, but the rules are powerless to change human nature. Only Jesus Christ can do that. See, rules cannot bring peace to a troubled mind, to a troubled conscience. This is what the writer in the book of Hebrews tells us about Judaism. He said, keeping the law of Moses can never bring you peace. No, the only way you can have peace is through Jesus Christ. And then another thing I've discovered about their rules is the rules are easily twisted by people that want to cheat. Easily twisted. Let me, for instance, give you an illustration. This is something I learned from personal experience. In my travels into Egypt, there were a lot of wealthy oil men that came into Egypt for business purposes. When they came there, of course, they're not going to be immoral. No. So what do? The poor farmers bring their daughters in and will sell them as a bride for $200. $200 that's a lot of money to a farmer in Egypt. $200. And so for the price of the bride, $200. And the man keeps her for 1 week, 2 weeks. While he is in Egypt, she is his wife. And he can have as much sex as he wants with her. At the end of his time, he simply says, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. And it's final. He walks out a free man. She goes back to her family, back to the farmer and his wife. What a tragedy. It became such a big problem, they actually had to create another rule, another law in Egypt, not allowing foreigners to come in and get married because people cheat. Boy, God understood that, and that's why Christianity is not based on a lot of rules. Contrary to some people's belief, that is not Christianity. We are called to live by grace through faith. That's the way we live the Christian life. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is the Quran. The Quran, of course, is the holy book of Islam. Now, as you attempt to read it, and I have done this, I must confess, I never finished it because it was very, very difficult reading. But I have read at least 1/3, maybe a half of the Quran. There is no chronological order in the Quran. In other words, whatever Muhammad would talk about, they would write down his words. The next day or the next time they were gathered together, he would give them a different story. There was no chronological order at all. It was all originally written in Arabic. And there are many of their scholars that believe that is the only way you can understand it. You must first learn the Arabic language. Now, because of this, because they make it difficult, approximately 70% of all Muslims have never read the Quran, and yet at the same time they believe it to be God's final revelation to mankind. Now that creates problems. When the majority of them have not read it, that means they're only listening to the interpretation of what somebody else tells them the Quran says and means. Let me give you some of the quotes, and I realize in pulling out specific quotes that you can do injustice to the text by the whole book. But just to show you, the Quran is very strong in its warlike opinions. The Quran, for instance, you read these words: fight the people until they believe in God and his message. That is a direct quote from the Quran. Here's another one: take not the Jews and the Christians for your friends. That is a direct quote from the Quran. Here's another one: Christians call Christ the Son of God. Allah's curse be upon them. Now, you'll notice in these quotes from the Quran, the very aggressive nature that is being expressed here. A very aggressive nature, a warlike spirit that is there. Let me give you a couple more. Here's another one. He says, and this is a quote from the Quran: fight those who do not believe in Allah and his messenger. That is one of the statements that the Prophet Muhammad gave. And then another one: fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them. And then finally, Muhammad himself says, I was commanded to fight the people. Now, again, I understand I'm pulling out specific verses, and you can do that and make something say almost anything. But all I'm emphasizing here is there is a very warlike nature to this. And Muhammad himself was a fighter. He was continually trying to conquer the people for Allah. And so those that follow him, it's no surprise that they follow his example. Here's a third contrast that I want to talk about. There is no mercy, no grace in Islam. It's not showed, it's not displayed at all. As I made the point before, in Islam there's no mercy, no grace. In Judaism, there's the concept of mercy. In Christianity, it goes beyond mercy to grace. But you do not find that in Islam. In Islam, the Muslims believe that Allah, the Creator, is above the emotions, the feeling of emotions of human beings. They don't believe that, in fact, they believe that that is being blasphemous to say that he can feel what we feel. No, he's viewed like an absentee landlord that's detached from his creation. He's above all those feelings. He doesn't feel what you and I feel. Of course, that is actually the opposite of what you and I believe as Christians. As Christians, we believe God is love. The Quran never says that Allah is love. Not one time. Yet our Bible tells us that's the nature of our God. Our God is love. Now, to show you the contrast here on mercy, let me give you two stories. Two stories of adulterous women. The first one I will talk about is Muhammad. They brought to Muhammad, and this is recorded in the stories of Muhammad. They brought to Muhammad a woman that had committed adultery and was pregnant from her adulterous activities. What should we do to her, they say. Muhammad said, wait until the baby is born and then bring her back to me. They did that. When the baby was born to the woman, they brought her back and they said, now you said to bring her back. What do we do with this woman that's committed adultery? And he said, let her alone until the baby is weaned of its mother. Then bring her back to me. They bring her back the third time after the baby is weaned, and they say, now what do we do? And Muhammad said, take her and kill her and give the baby to a good Muslim mother. That was the words of the Prophet Muhammad. But there's another story that's recorded in the Bible about Jesus and an adulterous woman that was brought to him, caught in the very act of adultery. And they come to Jesus saying, Moses said we should stone her, but what do you say? And Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Now, that is a vivid contrast between Islam and Christianity. And it leads me to the fourth thing I want to talk about. Let me talk about women's rights. Women's rights. Now, I've traveled through many of the different nations in the Mideast and in the neighboring countries, been very close to a lot of these people, and these are things that I have observed. Women are treated as inferior to men in Islam. They do not have equal rights. In fact, in court of law, it takes two women to equal one man in court of law. They're treated as second-class citizens as best. Many times, they are treated as nothing more than slaves. And Islamic countries, they have the world's highest birth rates, the highest illiteracy rates. So these people live in poverty conditions, in very primitive conditions. And one of the things that I've discovered in my studies was that, and this was shocking to me personally, the Quran makes no promises to women of paradise. Never is it mentioned. Of men, oh yes, it talks about men in paradise, but never does it reference one time women in paradise. That was shocking for me to discover. In talking about the discrepancies between men and women in Islam, a man can have up to 4 wives at one time, if he's able to support them. Up to 4 wives at a time. Divorce is a simple thing. Divorce is simply by saying, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. If he says it 3 times in succession, it's final. The divorce is finished. It's over. It's done. That's how simple. And so this is why many men have multiple wives, one wife after another, because when they're tired of her, they just simply say, I divorce you 3 times in succession, and it's over. That marriage is gone, and he's free now to marry someone else. Women's rights, it's a terrible condition that they live in. Another one of the tragedies that occurs on a regular basis, do you realize every day, 6,000 girls suffer what the United Nations calls female genital mutilation. Every day, 6,000 of them in Islamic countries all over the world. And of course, they call it circumcision, but it's butchery, my friend. The United Nations got it right. Female genital mutilation. It goes on continually, and they suffer terribly. Now, it has been well said, if you want to understand a religion, then watch the way that they treat women and children. I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. Because the innocents, those that cannot protect themselves, when I read about the Ayatollah Khomeini sending 8-year-old, 10-year-old boys out into the minefields to blow themselves up so he could send his soldiers through without them being in danger of being killed. Said, what a terrible, terrible concept of religion. It brings me to my fifth point, what I will call religious persecution. Religious persecution. You have to understand that this is a part of their lifestyle, their thinking. For instance, slavery. Slavery is still, to this day, legal and practiced in many Islamic countries. To this very day, thousands of women and children are sold annually as slaves by Muslims. It goes on a continual basis. Now, where this is happening in our world today, most of these that are being sold as slaves, the women and children, most of them are African Christians who are being sold to countries in the Middle East. They are buying them because of the oil money, because of the money that they have. And so they buy these slaves who actually were Christian women and children. And so they look upon it as the prize of war. When they're able to capture them, they make them their slaves. They're slaves. It's a totally different concept between Islam and Christianity. Here's the sixth thing I want to discuss. The difference between Christianity and Islam is what they call holy war. Holy war. Now, it's approximately 15% of the Muslims that are involved in this ongoing battle. Approximately 15%. They're fighting what they call holy war. And where most of this conflict is so bad are in the places where Islam is bumping up against Christianity, like a country, for instance, let me mention some of the countries they call with bloody borders. Nigeria, for instance. Nigeria is almost 50% Christian, 50% Islam. There's so much conflict there. Palestine, of course, Palestine, we know that it bumps up against Israel. They're fighting there over the land. Iraq, there's so much fighting. Kashmir is a country just to the north of India. It is broken away from India. There's constant fighting there between the Hindus and the Muslims. Sudan. At one time, there actually were more Christians in Sudan than there were Islamics. But there's been a major invasion from the north. They're trying to conquer it. They divided the country. Now they're fighting in South Sudan, trying to take over that part. Indonesia, there's a large Christian population in Indonesia, and so there's what they call bloody wars. And then the Philippines. The Philippines, I've been there many times, and the southern island of Mindanao. The Islamics are trying to make that a separate Islamic nation. This is what is called the bloody wars, bloody borders, because they're continually fighting with their neighbors. They believe it's a legitimate way of conquest. They believe in the principle that the end justifies the means. And I can tell you story after story of things that I've learned in my travels, how that they will do terrible things, but they justify it by saying it was for a good reason. It was for the advancement of Islam. It was for the good of Allah. And so they justify that. And they will use whatever terror is necessary to be able to win their holy war. That's a misnomer. It's nothing holy about it, my friend. It's constant fighting, trying to convert the world by the use of the sword. Now, for you and I as Christians, we're fighting a spiritual battle. We're using spiritual weapons. But for the devil, even witchcraft is called a work of the flesh. He only has carnal weapons, and that's why he is using them in this battle against Christianity. Now, how should we respond? What should be our response? We have to be very careful to keep our focus on Jesus Christ. He is our goal. He is our hero. He is our God. We want to be like him. But the truth is, we become like whatever we think about, whatever we focus upon. That's why you need to keep your focus on Christ, because God is love, and you will become loving if you focus on him. But if you focus on hatred, you will become more hateful. So how should we respond to this? First of all, do nothing without prayer. Nothing. In everything by prayer and supplication. Paul in another place said, I would first of all that men pray. Do nothing without prayer. The words of Jesus are they're classic words, beautiful words. Jesus said, I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. Matthew 5:44. Boy, pray. That should be the first response. How should we pray? Pray that they will experience supernatural manifestations of Christ. Boy, that's a good way to pray. In my travels, every trip that I ever took, I listened to their stories as they would tell me how Jesus appeared to them in a dream or in a vision, or just appeared to them in what they felt was living virtual reality, as he would tell them he is the Christ. We need to pray about that. We need to pray for the oppressed women and children. They suffer so much by cruel ideology. They suffer so much by cruel thoughts, violent thinking. They're treated like slaves, as nothing. We need to remember them in our prayers. Here's another thing we need to be praying about. We need to pray for the Christian workers in Islamic nations. They suffer so much persecution, so many things, and I could tell you story after story of the painful experiences that they have gone through. And one of the things that the devil tries to make them believe is everybody's forgotten them, that they're all alone, that nobody cares. That's not true. So please, you and I must remember to pray for those that are laboring, faithfully working in Islamic nations. Another thing, pray for the new believers. The new believers in these Islamic countries. We do not understand that in the West. We think we're being persecuted because somebody doesn't like us, or somebody said something nasty about our religious beliefs. That's not persecution. No, these people suffer terribly for their faith. And the young converts, they suffer the most because they're still struggling to try to learn how to live the Christian life, and they're being cut off from everything that they know. I've talked to many of the refugees, many of the people that have had to flee from these oppressive situations, and they've lost everything. They lost family, They lost their jobs. If they were students, they lost their scholarships. They lost their nation, their families. They had to leave, flee for their lives. We need to remember them in prayer. As the apostle said, just like we were suffering alongside them. They are our brothers, our sisters. Pray for them. And then the final thing I want to talk about is we need to support strategic Christian ministries. These are Christian ministries that are laboring and working among Islamic people. These people that have never heard the gospel. They've never received the beautiful teachings and truths that you and I have. They fear for their very lives. In many of those places, they hide their Bibles or whatever scripture portions they have because it's considered a crime to even possess them. And yet, we in the West, we in the United States give less than 10% of our missions offerings to countries, ministries that are focusing on Islamic nations. Less than 10%. I think we're making a mistake. If we're going to fulfill the Great Commission, then we're going to have to go to the world of Islam. When it said God so loved the world, that included the world of Islam. You have to realize the Islamic world is the last frontier for fulfilling the Great Commission of Jesus Christ. The last frontier. And we must rise up and complete the job that Jesus gave us to do. So God help us to refocus our attention and not forget them, but rather pray for them. Give to support the workers that are working among them, because everybody deserves to hear the good news of Jesus. Nobody should hear it twice until everyone has heard the gospel at least one time.